The old man looked from the dog to the boy. The shadow across his face lifted and revealed eyes as blue as Frederick's. He probably smells the other dogs on me, the old man said. What other dogs? Frederick asked, looking around. On my farm, over there. The old man gestured from where he came, and the boy saw the outline of several large dogs running through the sun just beyond the trees. They look like mastiffs, Frederick said, holding his hand over his eyes. They are, the old man said, nodding his head in approval. He stepped closer to the bank of the pond. Speak, boys! The old man called out, and the dogs gathered together between the trees and responded with a chorus of loud barks, their heads lifting and the front paws coming off the ground as they called out. Frederick laughed, and Brutus called back. The old man took off his hat and turned to Brutus, smiling. Brutus became positively agitated with excitement. Frederick held the leash and pulled back to restrain the dog. The old man turned back to his dogs and held his hand up. Enough, he called out, and the barking stopped and the dogs turned away from the trees. Brutus even stopped barking, but panted loudly as he strained towards the old man. I'm sorry, I don't know what's gotten into him, Frederick said, the skin on his hands burning as he held the leash. It's okay, the old man said, approaching Brutus. The old man's hair was long, and he brushed it from his eyes. The familiarity intensified, but Frederick still could not place it. May I? The old man asked, holding his hand out for the leash. Frederick nodded. The old man took the leash and led Brutus toward the pond, turned, and walked along the bank. Frederick looked down and saw the leash was still in his hand, and he was walking along the bank of the pond with Brutus at heel by his side. He looked over his shoulder. The old man stood watching them, his face reflecting the joy that Frederick felt. Frederick brought Brutus to the tree and hopped up. They crossed to the other side and approached the trees from where the old man had come. The sunlight angled almost parallel to the ground and pierced Frederick's eyes with its brightness. He held his hand before his face and saw the outlines of the old man's dogs. The dogs bounded to and fro on the other side of the trees, tails stuck up, barking exultantly. Frederick took a step towards the dogs, and the barking grew louder, and the dogs gathered together as if awaiting his arrival. He took another step, but Brutus held him back. Come, boy, Frederick said without looking at Brutus. But the dogs stayed put. Frederick turned. Brutus's head was looking over at the old man, who stood on the opposite bank, still watching them. Brutus? Frederick said apprehensively, holding his hand to the dog. The old man stood with Brutus on the opposite bank at the cusp of the trees from where he came. Frederick watched from the other side, his hand held up before him. The old man made to walk into the sunlight with Brutus in tow. Frederick took a step forward, his heart thudding in his chest. But the old man stopped and then knelt to Brutus and pressed his face into the dog's muzzle. Brutus coated Frederick's face with saliva as he held his dog's cheeks. He stood up from his dog and felt the leash in his hand once again. The old man stood before him, hands in his pockets, his hat back on his head. You've done very well with him, the old man said. Very well, he repeated, almost reverently. He turned and quickly hopped the tree, crossed to the other side, and approached the trees from where he came. He stood looking through the sunlight. His dogs gathered before him, but he waved his hand and they dispersed back beyond the trees. He turned and said to Frederick, He's a dog fit for a king. He tipped his hat, turned, and was consumed by sunlight. Frederick squinted and blinked several times. Several dogs ran to him and a woman waved to him from the porch of a farmhouse. He rubbed his eyes, opened them, and was looking out onto the surface of the pond. The sunlight had sunk below the horizon. The sky was dark blue and the pond was gray and murky. The trees towered above him, dark vacant objects that seemed to close in. Come, boy, Frederick said, and they turned back to the path and made for home. Nighttime was imminent as blue faded to dark purple and red in the sky. They crossed the field of grass, which stood still and quiet. The woods became familiar, and he could see the rooftops of the houses in his neighborhood up ahead. They made their way to their house, and Frederick opened the gate, the back gate of the fence. His father was sitting on the back porch, reading with the light on. Frederick unlatched the leash from Brutus's collar as they approached, and Brutus bounded for the back door. You two have been gone for a while, his father said, setting the book down in his lap and slapping Brutus playfully on the rump. Frederick shrugged, a pensive look on his face. You okay? His father asked. Yeah, I'm going to go feed Brutus. Okay, his father stood up. Your mother is getting dinner ready. Frederick nodded and walked past his father to the door. Frederick? His father placed his hand on his son's shoulder. Frederick looked up. Yeah? You sure you're okay, son? Yeah, I'm just seeing the world. Frederick looked back down at Brutus. The dog licked his chops. his tongue popping loudly through his lips. And how was it? Brutus scratched at the back door, grumbled, and sat on his haunches and panted. His big tongue spilled out to the side of his mouth and bounced with each breath. It was good, Frederick said. Yeah, you looking forward to school? Frederick forced himself not to roll his eyes, but his father saw the effort. Sorry, his father said amusedly. But Frederick shook his head. It's fine, he said. But it was good, huh? The world? His father asked, moving to the door. Brutus stepped aside and waited anxiously to enter. Frederick stepped to Brutus and scratched the dog's ears. Brutus lifted his head to Frederick and sat with his body pressed to the boy's legs. His father looked down at them, smiling proudly. It is, Frederick said.